whole idea of the untapped potential of the mind kind of gets debunked by a lot of science people because of the misconception. It's really just a slight misunderstanding, and I'm still a firm believer that we only use a fraction of our potential. But one of the things that I clarify in my book is that I'm talking about capacity, the capacity of the mind, and not how much of the brain we're using. So when you look at an MRI, and they actually have images now that they can actually map in real time, so they can see the different parts of the brain as they're being activated. And it's actually true that we use the whole brain, because as we grow and develop, different parts of the brain are mapped out according to uses. There's some that are more heavily used when we're speaking, some more heavily used when we're doing things like moving our fingers. And actually, did you know that this little movement of your fingers takes huge resources in your brain? Just those fine motor skills that we develop takes huge resources. So we're actually using the whole brain, but when I'm talking about capacity, that, it was once believed that we're only using about 10% of the capacity, and some of the more recent estimates that I've seen some that actually have downgraded that to around 2 to 3% of the capacity of not just the brain, but the mind. We're talking about the wiring of the brain. So as we're growing and developing, there are just trillions and trillions of connections. And so as we commit ourselves to using our brains in certain ways, then those connections become more hardwired. So we're actually rewiring our brain as we're growing and developing. So when we're born, there are just infinite potentials of connections that we can make. So for example, language is something that's formed early on. So they've done a lot of studies that demonstrate that kids, when they're younger, are much more adept at taking on new languages, so they could be bilingual, trilingual very easily. Has anybody tried to pick up a new language in adulthood? I'm still working on Spanish. My wife is fluent in 2 other languages because she went to Spain and France when she was in college. But yeah, I haven't had one of those immersion experiences yet. I'm still working with Spanish. It takes a while, and it really takes an immersion experience to really get it down. But it takes longer to reform those connections in our brain when we're older. And it's not that it can't be done, it's just that there's a lot of patterns that we've already established, a lot of decisions that we've already made in our lives. So we can change the wiring, but it takes a little longer. Now, it was really interesting. There's a disease called hydrocephalus, which sometimes people call it water on the brain. It's actually cerebral spinal fluid that forms on the brain because it doesn't drain properly. And there was actually a case study that I looked at that was really interesting, because this child had probably 95% of his brain was destroyed by this, and was left with a part of the brain about the size of a walnut. And yet, it happened at an early enough stage that all of the functions of the brain were able to reroute within that tiny little section, and the boy actually became a genius. Because when they did an MRI, there was so much capacity that was opened up just in that little tiny section. Now this, unfortunately, is not typical. It's often fatal and can be very damaging. But that case study, though, was a really good example that the potential is there. If from the beginning we are using more of the capacity of the mind, then there's incredible potential that's there. And so when I'm talking about capacity, the brain is really more like the hardware, kind of like our computer, and our mind is the user. So the brain is going to form according to what we are using. And so it will adjust to our capacity. So there's infinite potential there. We just need to tap into that. And part of that is realizing who we are.